It is not a Hollywood invention dressed up to look real. This is Colorado. This is the late 1800s and early 1900s. This is a time when the mountains kept secrets better than any man alive, when gold and silver ran through the veins of the earth like blood, and when certain men, dangerous, clever, beautiful in their own violent way, decided the wealth of this new world belonged to whoever was bold enough to take it. Joseph, Red Jack Lupo, was one of those men. He was not born into legend. He was not handed anything, climbed over fences, over law, over other men's bodies if he had to, until the name Red Jack echoed from the saloons of Denver to the mountain passes of the Rockies, till lawmen whispered it with a particular kind of dread, and until ordinary people, the miners and the merchants and the farmers who had nothing, said it was something dangerously close to admiration. This is the story of his rise, his reign, his obsession, his unraveling, and his final, defiant curtain call. Before we dive in, drop a comment right now. Tell me where in the world you're watching this from, and what time it is where you are. Whether you're in a quiet apartment in Chicago at midnight, or sitting in the afternoon sun somewhere overseas, I want to know. This story was built for the restless ones. It's the ones who stay up a little too late, who are drawn to the shadows, who feel something stir in their chest when they hear a name spoken the right way, a name like Red Jack. Let's go. There is a particular kind of hunger that only poverty can plant inside a person. Not the hunger you feel before dinner, not the kind that a warm meal and a glass of water can fix. No, this hunger lives deeper. It settles into the bones in childhood, and it never quite leaves. It whispers at night. It watches other people's wealth through dirty windows. It calculates and schemes and waits. Joseph Lupo knew that hunger before he knew almost anything else about the world. The details of his early life are scattered. The way the records of poor men always are patchy, incomplete, as if history itself couldn't quite be bothered to write down the beginnings of someone who hadn't yet proven they were worth remembering. What we know is that Joseph Lupo was born into a life of scarcity somewhere in the late 1860s or early 1870s. The product of an immigrant family who had come to America with the same dream that millions carried across the Atlantic, the idea that this country was a place where a man could become something, where a man could start from nothing and build himself into something permanent. That dream, as it so often did, it's collided hard with reality. The American West in those years was not the romantic landscape of dime novels and Wild West shows. It was brutal and indifferent. It was boom and bust, feast and famine, the thrill of a silver strike followed by the misery of a mine that ran dry. Families scraped and clawed and prayed and still ended up with cold floors and empty tables. Children grew up watching their fathers broken by labor, men who bent their backs for the mining companies and the railroad barons and the cattle ranchers, men who gave everything and received just enough to keep giving. Joseph Lupo watched. He watched it carefully. And somewhere in that watching, something in him decided, no, not me. Not like that. What set young Joseph apart was not cruelty, at least not yet. And it was not even ambition in the conventional sense. What set him apart was his mind. People who encountered him in those early years remembered a sharpness behind his eyes, a quality of attention that made you feel like he was always reading you, always measuring the distance between where you were and where he needed you to be. He was not the biggest boy, he was not the loudest, but when he spoke, people listened, because there was a precision to the way he chose his words that made you understand something real was behind them. He drifted. The way restless young men in the West drifted from mining camps to cattle, towns picking up work where he could find it, learning the rhythms of a world built on extraction and transaction. He learned to read people the way old-timers read weather, by the small signs. The way a man shifted his weight, the way eyes moved in a room, what a man's hands were doing when his mouth was saying something different. He gambled. He ran small. Cons. Nothing that would get a man hanged, but enough to sharpen the edges of who he was becoming. Colorado, by this point, was in the grip of its silver age. Towns like Leadville and Aspen and Telluride were exploding with money. Raw, violent, barely organized money. Fortunes were being made in the dark under the mountains, carried out on the backs of immigrants and desperados and dreamers, and then funneled up into the hands of men who sat in offices and wore clean suits and called themselves respectable. The banks of Colorado were fat with silver wealth. The stagecoaches that rolled across mountain passes carried payrolls and strong boxes. And the railroads, still threading their iron veins through the Rockies, moved cash in quantities that would make a man's head swim. Joseph Lupo looked at all of this the way an architect looks at a building, not as something solid and permanent, but as something with a structure, with weak points, with doors that could be opened if you had the right key or the right audacity. He was not yet Red Jack. He was not yet a name. He was still just a young man with copper-red hair and watchful eyes and a hunger that no honest wage would ever satisfy. But that was about to change. Asterisk. The moment it changed was the moment he crossed paths with a man known only as Harlan A., veteran road agent who had operated in the mountains for years. A man who understood that the difference between a successful outlaw and a dead one was not bravery or firepower, but planning. Harlan was getting old. His hands shook slightly in cold weather. He needed a partner with young eyes and a young man's nerve. Joseph Lupo was exactly that. What Harlan offered in return was education, the real kind, the kind no schoolroom. In the West offered an education in the geography of crime, in the timing of stagecoach routes, in the reading of law enforcement patterns, in the art of making yourself disappear into the mountain terrain after a job as if the rocks themselves had swallowed you. Their partnership lasted 2 years. In those 2 years, Joseph Lupo robbed his first stagecoach, his second, his fourth. He learned to stay calm under the particular pressure of a moment when everything could go wrong. He learned to command a scene, to walk into the chaos of a robbery with such certainty that the victims almost always complied. Because something in the way he stood and the way he spoke communicated that resistance was simply not a viable option. He developed, in those years, his signature, because every great outlaw had one, a detail, a gesture, a calling card that turned a crime into a story that people repeated. For Joseph Lupo, it came naturally. His hair was the color of a dying fire, a deep, vivid red that was impossible to mistake. On the road, he took to wearing a red handkerchief over his face during jobs, a detail that was partly practical and partly something else, something theatrical, as if he wanted the witnesses to remember something specific.
As if he understood.
Even then, that the telling of a story was almost as important as the story itself, they started calling him Red Jack somewhere along the line. He never corrected anyone. When Harlan finally retired or died, accounts differ, Joseph Lupo did not slow down. He accelerated. He began to recruit, to build, to think larger. He had learned enough. The apprenticeship was over. Red Jack was open for business. There is a quality that separates the outlaw who gets caught after 2 jobs from the one who operates for years, accumulating both wealth and legend, and that quality is organization. Raw nerve gets you through the door. Raw nerve alone gets you killed or caged inside of a year. What keeps a man free and functioning in the criminal world, especially in the wild, surveilled, interconnected world of a growing American state, is the ability to think systematically, to build something that can survive individual mistakes, to create in the language of modern business. Structure. Red Jack Lupo built a structure. By the mid-1890s. With Colorado fully in the grip of its silver and gold economy, Lupo had assembled around himself a network that operated less like a gang in the traditional sense and more like what we might today call an organization. He had lieutenants, trusted men who managed specific aspects of operations. He had scouts, ordinary-looking individuals who drifted through towns and railroad stops, collecting information about schedules, payroll shipments, law enforcement, movements. He had contacts in the legitimate world, bartenders, stable hands, hotel clerks, people who kept their eyes open and their mouths shut in exchange for small but reliable payments. He chose his men with deliberate care. He was not looking for the loudest voice or the fastest gun. He was looking for a specific temperament, calm under pressure. disciplined in the details, capable of following a plan without improvising in the middle of it. Improvisation, Lupo believed, was how men died and how plans fell apart. Job was rehearsed in the geography of conversation before it was executed in the geography of the actual world. Routes were walked. Timing was calibrated. Contingencies were discussed. What happens if there's an extra guard? What happens if the coach is running late? What happens if someone in the party decides to be a hero? The targets themselves were selected with a cold, strategic intelligence. Lupo understood something that many of his contemporaries did not, that in the booming economy of the Colorado mountains, the richest and most vulnerable targets were not the stagecoaches themselves, which were getting more guarded and more fortified as the years went on, but the payroll shipments tied to the mining operations that fed the state's economy. Mining companies employed hundreds of men. Those men needed to be paid in cash, in reliable intervals. That cash had to travel from banks in Denver or Pueblo or Colorado Springs to the remote mountain operations where the men worked. By stagecoach, by private courier, occasionally by early railroad car. And the logistics of those deliveries, the routes, the timing, the weight of the cargo could be learned if you knew the right people to ask or to bribe. Lupo also understood geography the way a military general understands. Battlefield. Colorado's terrain was both an obstacle and an advantage. The mountain passes that made travel difficult also made pursuit difficult. The ravines and the pine forests and the high plateaus offered cover that flat country lawmen simply had no experience navigating. Lupo knew these landscapes intimately, spent time in them, not just on jobs but in the spaces between jobs, riding routes, memorizing the way trails connected to trails, identifying the places where a man on horseback could disappear into the rock and timber in minutes and reappear 50 miles away without anyone being able to track him. His operation during its peak years, roughly 1893 to 1900, is believed to have been responsible for somewhere between 15 and 25 successful robberies, though the exact number is disputed because not all of them were conclusively connected to him at the time. The total take during this period ran into what would today be hundreds of thousands of dollars. At the time, it was staggering amounts that would set a family up for generations, amounts that mining companies and banks logged as significant losses, amounts that made the authorities in Denver increasingly uncomfortable and increasingly determined. But here is the thing about Red Jack that made him genuinely difficult to catch. Beyond the planning and the geography and the organization, the thing that made him truly dangerous to the mechanisms of law enforcement was something more personal, more human. He was charming, not charming in the slick, greasy way of a con man. Charming in the way of a man who genuinely understood people. Who could read a room and adjust himself to it? Who could walk into a saloon in one town and be remembered as a quiet, good-humored drifter and walk into a different town the next week and be remembered as a prospector with a funny story about a bear? He had many faces, and he wore all of them naturally. He was never the strangest man in the room. He was never the one who made you uncomfortable. He blended. He listened more than he spoke. And when he spoke, he made you feel somehow that he was genuinely interested in you, which is perhaps the oldest and most powerful form of manipulation there is. This extended to women. And here the story takes on its most human dimension. Red. Jack Lupo was not a man who avoided attachment. He formed real connections, or at least connections that felt real, that had the texture and warmth of genuine feeling, even if they also served tactical purposes. There were women in his orbit in several towns who sheltered him, who provided him with information about local law enforcement, who gave him a reason to be somewhere without raising suspicion. Whether he loved any of them is the kind of question that the historical record cannot fully answer. What it can tell us is that they were loyal to him, and that loyalty freely given, not coerced, speaks to something in the man that went beyond pure calculation. He was also, within his own code, something approaching honorable. There are no credible accounts of Red Jack Lupo killing anyone during a robbery who was not actively, aggressively, trying to stop the robbery with lethal force. He was not a sadist. He did not terrorize the ordinary passengers on coaches he stopped beyond what was necessary to complete the job. He took cash, he took valuables, and he moved on. Witnesses described him as almost courteous, a quality that, strange as it sounds, contributed to his legend. Because people could not quite make him into a monster. They could call him a criminal, a thief, a road agent. They could not easily make him into a devil. And legends that carry a hint of ambiguity, legends where the audience is not quite sure how to feel, those are the ones that last. By the late 1890s, Red Jack Lupo was the most wanted man in Colorado. His name was in the newspapers. There was a price on his head, a reward that climbed as the robberies continued and the losses mounted. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, that fearsome private law enforcement organization that had hunted Jesse James and would eventually help bring down Butch Cassidy, had taken an interest. Lupo was aware of this. He had contacts who kept him informed. And rather than fleeing the state, rather than going to ground somewhere in New Mexico or Wyoming and starting over with a new name and a quieter life, he did what all truly dangerous men eventually do when they have spent too long at the top. He got bold. There are moments in the life of any figure who achieves a kind of notoriety, criminal, political, artistic, when they do something so audacious, so far beyond the expected scale of what anyone believed them capable of, that it reshapes the entire story. It becomes the moment you point to afterward, when you ask yourself, how did we not see what was coming? Red Jack Lupo had several such moments, but the ones that truly carved his name into the stone of Colorado history came in the final. Blazing years of the 1890s, the years when he was most watched, most hunted, and somehow impossibly most active. The robbery that elevated him from notorious outlaw to full legend happened in the spring of 1898. The target was a Silver Creek Mining Company payroll shipment, one of the largest single cash deliveries in the company's history, carrying the wages for nearly 400 miners who had been working extended shifts through a brutal winter. The shipment was moving by private coach from Pueblo to a mountain camp in the San Juan region, guarded by 4 armed men, the route kept as secret as the company's security people could manage. Red Jack knew about it 3 weeks before it moved. His intelligence came through a web of contacts too tangled to fully reconstruct. A clerk at the mining company's Pueblo office who owed a gambling debt to a man who knew a man who was on Lupo's payroll, stable hand who overheard a conversation between 2 guards about when they'd be riding next. Lupo assembled the pieces with the patience of a man who understood that the preparation was the job, that the actual moment of taking was almost an afterthought if the work beforehand had been done correctly. He chose a narrow passage in the mountains, a section of the road where the terrain forced the coach to slow nearly to a walk and where the tree coverage was dense enough on both sides to conceal a full team of men until the moment of execution. He positioned 6 men in total, himself included. He rehearsed the choreography of the operation until every man knew exactly where he would be standing, exactly what he was responsible for, exactly what the signal was, and what it meant when they heard it. When the coach entered the passage on a cold, clear morning, it was over in less than 4 minutes. 4 guards, 6 armed men, in perfect position. It was not a fight. The guards were professional enough to understand the math of their situation. The payroll was taken. The guards were bound, treated without excessive violence, and left in a position where they could free themselves within an hour. Lupo and his men dissolved into the mountain terrain along pre-planned routes, each carrying a portion of the cash, each moving toward a different safe house, the total haul to be divided at a rendezvous point 2 days later. The Silver Creek robbery, as the newspapers immediately dubbed it, sent a shock through the Colorado business establishment that can only be described as institutional panic. The amount taken was extraordinary. The audacity of it, targeting one of the biggest payroll shipments in the state's recent memory, with armed protection in broad daylight, communicated something that the mining companies and the banking interests and the political establishment found profoundly disturbing. This was not an opportunistic thief. This was not a desperate man grabbing what he could and running. This was an intelligence operation. This was coordination. This was something that required resources and information and a kind of organizational, capacity that made the whole thing feel less like a crime and more like a statement. The newspapers ran the story for weeks, and in the way of newspaper stories everywhere and in every era, the telling accumulated details that may or may not have been entirely accurate. Red Jack Lupo was described as supremely tall, though witnesses gave varying heights, he was said. To be armed with an unusual pistol, he was said to have made a remark wry, almost philosophical, to one of the guards before leaving the scene. Whether any of these specific details were true is uncertain. What is certain is that they were repeated, and in the repetition they became more real than reality. He was, by this point, a figure who had crossed from criminal into something stranger, into myth. And myth has a particular gravity, pulls things toward it. It attracts the attention of people who want to be near it, who want to associate themselves with it. And that gravity, that magnetism that legend generates, is one of the most dangerous forces a man operating outside the law can be caught in, because the same attention that creates the legend also makes you visible, makes you a target, draws the wrong kind of people into your orbit. He robbed twice more in the year following Silver Creek, a smaller stagecoach operation near Telluride. A cash transfer connected to a cattle operation outside of Colorado Springs. Both were clean. Both were successful, and together they added to a body of work that was now undeniably attracting. Not just state law enforcement, but federal attention. The U.S. Marshals were coordinating with state authorities. Pinkerton's had a file on him, thick enough to be its own kind of monument, and in the small world of the Colorado criminal underground, there were men who watched Red Jack's success and felt something corrosive. Jealousy is the word, but it is not quite precise enough. What they felt was the particular resentment that comes from watching someone operate in the same world as you, with the same risks, and somehow through intelligence, through discipline, through a quality you cannot quite name or acquire, do it better. Do it so much better that their name fills the papers and yours does not. Those men began to talk, quietly at first, and then less quietly. The walls around Red Jack Lupo were closing in, and what made it tragic, what made it inevitable in the way that the best tragedies are inevitable, was that he could feel it, and he would not stop. Every man who achieves a kind of mythic status in his own lifetime carries within him the private reality that the myth was built to cover. Jesse James had his, Billy the Kid had his, and Red Jack Lupo had his. A private life lived in the margins of the public one, full of ordinary human texture, attachment, doubt, love, loneliness, and the specific exhaustion that comes from spending years performing a version of yourself that, slightly but crucially different from who you actually are. By 1899, Joseph Lupo was somewhere in his early 30s. He had been operating for nearly a decade at a serious level. He was wealthy by the standards of the world he'd grown up in, wealthy in the way of a man who keeps his money in various hidden places and can never deposit it in a bank. Wealthy in the way of a man who cannot explain to anyone how he came by it, which is a particular kind of wealth that has a shelf life. He had moved through a series of assumed identities, false names, rented rooms in boarding houses, in towns where no one knew him well enough to ask questions. He had friends, real ones, probably, though the distinction between friendship and utility blurs in the life of a man like him. He had enemies, some of whom he knew about, and some of whom he did not. And he had, at this point in his story, someone who mattered to him in a way that went beyond strategic value. Her name varies in different tellings, historical records of women in the lives of Western outlaws are notoriously unreliable, filtered through the prejudices of the men who wrote them down. Let us call her, as some accounts do, Marie. She was a woman of intelligence and practical capability, someone who understood perfectly what Red Jack was and had made a conscious choice about what that meant for her own life. She was not naive. She was not coerced. She was, by all available indication, someone who saw him clearly and chose him anyway, which says something about both of them. Their relationship was the kind that gets formed in the negative spaces of a dangerous life. In the hours between jobs, in the quiet rooms in small mountain towns, in the conversations had in low voices in the dark, he trusted her with things he trusted no one else with, not the operational details that was disciplined. That was simply how he kept himself alive. But the other things, the interior things, the doubts. The moments when the life he'd built felt less like freedom and more like a maze he'd constructed around himself and could no longer quite find the exit to. Because here is a truth that the legend does not always accommodate. The life of a successful outlaw in the American West was not primarily exciting. It was primarily waiting. It was primarily the management of anxiety, the low grade. Constant tension of a man who must always be assessing his environment, who cannot fully relax in any room, who wakes up knowing that the day could go sideways, in ways that no amount of planning can entirely prevent. It was the exhaustion of always being two people at once. It was the isolation of a life lived in performance, where the face you show the world is never quite your own face. Did he ever consider stopping? The question is easy to pose and impossible to fully answer. What we can observe is the behavior, and the behavior of a man who is genuinely considering stopping looks. Different from the behavior of Red Jack Lupo in 1899, he was not winding down. He was not transferring assets, not making arrangements for a different kind of life. He was still planning, still gathering intelligence, still holding his organization together with the specific force of his personality and his reputation. But there were, by the accounts of people who were close to him during this period, signs of something shifting, quality of distraction, moments when the famous discipline seemed to slip, when decisions were made that the Red Jack of 3 years earlier would not have made. Some of this was the pressure. The net around him was genuinely tightening. The Pinkerton operation had a name, and his name was in it. Informants were being cultivated. Men who knew him, being slowly and patiently worked by detectives who understood that the way you bring down an organization is not always through force, but through the patient introduction of doubt and self-interest into the relationships that hold it together. Some of it was a specific betrayal that hit him in a place. He had not adequately protected his trust. One of his lieutenants, a man he had known for years, a man who had ridden with him through multiple operations, a man whose family Lupo had helped support during hard times, had begun talking to authorities, not loudly, not all at once, but talking. The Pinkertons had found the right pressure point and applied it. And this man had begun to crack in ways that Red Jack had not yet detected. The irony was almost classical. The thing that had always protected Lupo, his ability to read people, his almost preternatural sense of who was reliable and who was not, had been blinded by the warmth of a long association. We do not easily read the betrayal in people. We have known for years. The mind resists it. The history of the relationship argues against it. And so we see what we expect to see until the moment we cannot anymore. Meanwhile, outside his personal world, the larger forces of history were also working against him. Colorado's wild period was ending. The railroad was everywhere now. Law enforcement was becoming more professionalized. The telegraph had transformed the speed at which information could travel, which meant that a robbery in one part of the state could be communicated to law enforcement in every other part within hours. The open, poorly coordinated landscape of enforcement that had made the 1880s and early 1890s so navigable for a man of Lupo's skills was closing. The infrastructure of consequence was getting faster and denser and harder to stay ahead of. He knew this. He was smart enough to know it. Knowing it made the exhaustion worse, and the exhaustion made the judgment worse, and the worst judgment created small mistakes that accumulated in ways that would eventually become impossible to survive. The crack in the armor was widening, and the people who wanted to bring Red Jack down were watching it widen with quiet, professional patience. The year 1900 arrived in Colorado like a turning page, and for Red Jack Lupo, it was precisely that, a turning moment when the narrative that had been building for nearly a decade began its inevitable downward arc. The ledger of a life. Lid. Outside the law has a particular accounting system. Every successful job extends the run, but it also adds weight to the eventual reckoning. By 1900, the weight had become extraordinary. The Pinkerton operation targeting Lupo had, by that year, developed into something sophisticated and multi-pronged. Unlike the blunt force of territorial marshals or the reactive scramble of local sheriffs, The Pinkertons worked the way water works, finding every available crack, applying constant pressure, never stopping, never needing a single dramatic breakthrough because they were comfortable building their case one small piece at a time. They had been watching the periphery of Lupo's organization for months. They had identified vulnerabilities. They had identified people. The lieutenant who had been talking, let us call him Davis, though his real name is uncertain, had by the spring of 1900 provided the Pinkertons with enough to sketch the broad shape of Lupo's operation. Routes. He favored safe houses he used, names of some of the men around him. The information was incomplete, but it was a map, and a partial map in the hands of skilled operatives is a powerful thing. There is a particular kind of knowledge that travels through criminal organizations at a speed that is invisible from the outside, a shift in atmosphere, a quality of tension in conversations that would have been easy a month ago. The most sensitive men in an organization feel it before they can name it. Red Jack was sensitive. He felt something change. Couldn't locate it precisely, but there was a shift in the air around certain people, a fractional hesitation, a quality of watchness that his instincts had been trained across a decade to detect. He made a decision that was both correct and insufficient. He contracted his operation, pulled back from some of the men whose reliability he was no longer certain of. He moved more carefully. He communicated less. He changed his patterns of movement, spending less time in the towns where he was most known and more time in the deep mountain territories where tracking him required specialized knowledge that most law enforcement simply did not have. But here's the tragedy of contracting an operation that has already been penetrated. Damage is already done. The information Davis had provided was already in the Pinkertons' files. The partial map had been shared with U.S. Marshals and state law enforcement. Lupo's contraction did slow things down. It did not stop them. The summer of 1900 was the last truly free summer of Joseph Lupo's life. He spent much of it in the high country, the plateaus and the passes, the terrain he had always felt most himself in. There is something almost elegiac about this period, viewed from the distance of history. A man at the full height of his capabilities in the landscape he loved, aware that something was coming and unable to quite run fast enough. He attempted one more operation during this period. A smaller job, a private cash shipment, not the audacious scale of Silver Creek, but a functional piece of business designed to maintain the cash flow that the organization ran on. The planning was careful. The execution was clean. But in the aftermath, something went wrong in a way that previous jobs had not. A witness who had seen too much, and who, unlike previous witnesses, had a reason to talk, a connection to law. Enforcement that Lupo had not known about. The information moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, the U.S. Marshals had coordinates. Not exactly his location. Lupo was too skilled for that. But a narrowed territory. A set of probable locations. A tightened circle. And then there was Davis. Fully turned now. Fully committed to the deal he had made with the authorities' freedom in exchange. For the one piece of information that would close the circle entirely, he knew a rendezvous point. A specific location in the mountains where Lupo had planned to meet with remaining members of his organization to divide the recent take and plan next steps. Davis gave it to the Pinkertons, and the Pinkertons gave it to the Marshals. When the arrest came, it came the way Lupo's own operations had always come from the terrain itself. Men positioned before the target arrived, patience, preparation, overwhelming force at the moment of contact. To eliminate the possibility of effective resistance, he was taken in the high country. On a September morning when the aspen trees were beginning to turn gold in the Colorado autumn and the air had the first bite of the coming cold, the accounts of the arrest describe a moment of stillness when Lupo understood what was happening, a beat, maybe two, when the famous calm held even as the reality of the situation crystallized around him. He did not fight. Whether this was tactical, recognizing that fighting was futile, or whether it was something else, something more interior. Some part of him that had been exhausted enough by the running that the moment of capture arrived with an unexpected quality of relief. No one can say for certain. What was recorded is that he was arrested without violence. that he spoke very little, and that the expression witnesses described on his face was not fear. The Colorado newspapers exploded. Red Jack Lupo, taken at last. The king of heists in custody. The headlines ran for days. There is a sound that a prison door makes when it closes behind a man for the first time that no writer has ever quite captured accurately. It is not dramatic. It is not the crashing, thunderous slam of the movies. It is something smaller than that, and therefore something worse. It is a solid, mechanical, deeply ordinary sound. The sound of a mechanism functioning exactly as it was designed to function. Indifferent to the man on the receiving end of it, indifferent to what that man had been before this moment, indifferent to the name he carried or the reputation attached to it or the fear that name had generated in the minds of Colorado's most powerful men for nearly a decade. The door closes. The mechanism engages. And the man who had moved through open mountain. Country like water moving through stone, always finding the path, is always in motion, always one careful step ahead becomes a number in a ledger, a body in a cell, a problem that has been solved. Joseph Lupo, Red Jack, the king of heists, the man whose name had filled Colorado's newspapers for years, walked through that door in the early months of 1901 and became the language of the Colorado State Penitentiary System, inmate number whatever they assigned him. The particulars of the number do not matter. What matters is what the number represented. The reduction of a human being to a unit of management. The translation of a life into a file. The conversion of a legend into a logistical problem. The Colorado State Penitentiary at Cannon City sat in a landscape that was, in its own way, as dramatic as the mountain passes Lupo had spent a decade navigating. The Arkansas River ran nearby. The mountains were visible on clear days, close enough to see, distant enough to feel like a taunt. The institution had been built with the particular philosophy that characterized American incarceration at the turn of the 20th century. The belief that the purpose of confinement was not merely to contain dangerous individuals, but to break them. To take the qualities that had made them dangerous, their will, their self-possession, their sense of their own power and capability, and grind those qualities down through monotony and labor and the systematic removal of every choice, until what remained was a man who had been made manageable. A man who had been made small enough to release back into the world without constituting a threat. The theory, as applied to Red Jack Lupo, countered an obstacle. The obstacle was the man himself, not in the way of defiance, not in the way of a man who arrives in prison looking for fights, who challenges authority at every turn, who makes his resistance loud and theatrical. That was never Lupo's way, and prison did not change it. He had always understood that the loudest performance of strength is usually the least efficient one. He had spent a decade operating through precision and stillness, in the careful application of intelligence rather than through brute force, and those habits of mind do not simply dissolve because the environment changes. They adapt. They find new terrain to work with. What the prison system encountered in Joseph Lupo was something that prison systems have always found genuinely difficult to manage. A man with an interior life substantial enough to be its own country. A man whose mind, because it had always been his primary tool, continued to function in confinement with something close to the same quality it had functioned in freedom. He observed, studied the rhythms of the institution, the way he had once studied the rhythms of mountain stagecoach routes. He identified the personalities of the guards, who was rigid, who had flexibility, who responded to respect, and who responded to invisibility. He mapped the social geography of the prison population, who held influence, where the real hierarchies ran underneath the official ones, which men were reliable and which were volatile. He did not do this with any particular operational purpose. In mind, there was no plan for escape, no scheme being assembled in the dark. He did it because it was simply how his mind worked. Because a man who has spent decades reading environments and people does not stop reading them simply because he is no longer in a position to act on what he reads. The reading itself is the habit. The reading itself is, in some fundamental sense, who he is. He worked. The labor requirements of the institution were not trivial, hard physical work in conditions that were difficult. supervised by men whose authority was backed by the full coercive capacity of the state. Lupo worked without complaint. This was noted by the guards and the administrative staff, and noted in the way that such things are always noted in institutions. As a quality to be catalogued rather than a humanity to be recognized, he was a good inmate. He caused no problems. He was assigned his work, and he did it, ate what was given, and slept when the schedule required it, and moved through the days with a quality of quiet, self-containment that the institution could not quite decide what to do with. The years inside were not without their internal weather. A man of his intelligence and energy, confined to a life of radical monotony, does not simply exist in a state of neutral suspension. There were periods of deep darkness, times when the distance between the life he had lived and the life he was living became too vast to contemplate without something that felt very much like grief. He had known what it was to move through the high mountain passes in the early morning, when the air was thin and cold and the world was still dark, except for the first line of light above the eastern peaks. He had known what it was to sit around a fire with men he trusted, planning something audacious, feeling the particular electricity of a risk that was carefully calculated but real. He had known what it was to ride hard through pine forest with money in the saddlebags and the knowledge that he had once again read the world correctly and moved through it on his own terms. All of that was gone, gone in the most complete and literal sense, not diminished, not distant, not temporarily unavailable, but structurally removed from the universe of possible experiences. And a man who has lived on a certain altitude of feeling, who has calibrated his entire existence to the demands of a life lived at extreme intensity, does not adapt to the flatlands of incarceration without cost. The cost was paid internally, invisibly, in the currency of those dark periods when the walls were just walls and the years ahead were just years, and the name Red Jack felt like something that had happened to a different person in a different world. But here's what is remarkable, and what speaks most clearly to the quality of the man beneath the legend. He did not break. He bent. Certainly no one moves through years of confinement without bending. But bending and breaking are different things, and Red Jack Lupo had built his entire career on the distinction between what could be controlled and what could not, who had spent a decade practicing the discipline of accepting the unchangeable, and focusing all energy on the changeable. That man understood confinement in a way that men without his particular training of mind could not. Asterisk. He could not change the walls, could not change the years on his sentence. He could not go back and unmake the choices that had led him here. And more importantly, and this is the part that is hardest to fully convey, he did not spend his energy trying to. He was not a man given to self-torture about the past. He had made his choices with full awareness of what they were. He had always known, in the clearest part of his mind, what the price of the life he was living would eventually be. He had simply chosen to defer the payment for as long as his skill and discipline could manage. The payment was now being collected. He paid it. Outside the walls of Cannon City, the world continued its relentless transformation in ways that Lupo could only partially track through the limited windows that prison life afforded conversations with other inmates, the occasional newspaper, the secondhand accounts of visitors, the way the guards talked about the world when they thought no one was listening. And the world that was being described in those fragments was a world that was accelerating away from everything he had known at a rate that must have been disorienting to contemplate. Colorado's silver economy, which had already been in decline at the time of his arrest, had by the middle years of his incarceration completed its collapse. The great silver camps, Leadville, Aspen, the San Juan operations had contracted dramatically. Some had closed entirely. The men who had worked them had scattered to other states. Other industries, other forms of labor that the 20th century was beginning to generate in abundance. The stagecoach routes that had been the arteries of his criminal career were being replaced not by improved stagecoach routes, but by something categorically different: the automobile. Not a strange and improbable machine that was beginning to appear on Colorado's roads with increasing regularity, changing the speed and the texture of movement in ways that made the entire landscape of his former profession seem not merely outdated, but almost archaeological. The railroads, which had already been threading through the mountains during his active years, were now everywhere, dense, efficient, connected to a national system that had fundamentally altered the economics of the region, the isolation. That had made the mountain passes such ideal terrain for a man of his particular skills, the isolation that had given a road agent the time and space to operate before law enforcement could coordinate a response. That isolation was being systematically eliminated by the very infrastructure that Colorado's wealth had funded, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which had played such a significant role in his eventual capture, was becoming an even more formidable institution. Its methods more sophisticated, its reach longer, its integration with various levels of law enforcement tighter. The world that had created the conditions for Red Jack Lupo's particular kind of career was not merely changing. It was ending. The ecological niche that he had occupied so brilliantly for a decade was being filled in, the way a quarry fills, with water slowly, then completely, and yet the legend persisted. This is the thing that the architects of institutions and the managers of consequences never quite account for, the way that a sufficiently vivid human story develops its own momentum, becomes its own kind of living thing, continues to move through the world independent of what happens to the person who generated it. Stories about Red Jack Lupo continued to circulate through the saloons and boarding houses and mining camps of Colorado, long after he was locked away, and in the way of stories that circulate without the inconvenience of the subject being present to correct them. These stories grew, they elaborated, they accumulated details that had not been present in the original accounts. The Silver Creek robbery became, in the telling, an operation of even more breathtaking scale. The payroll amount grew with each retelling. The number of guards doubled and then tripled. The precision of the execution became almost supernatural in the quality attributed to it. The story of his arrest was told and retold in versions where he had nearly escaped, where he had been within minutes of slipping through the net one final time before fortune turned against him. His courtesy to robbery victims, already a real and documented characteristic, became in legend a formal code, a chivalric system, a rule that he had maintained without exception throughout his entire career. There emerged, in the retelling of his story, among ordinary Coloradans, the miners and the farmers, and the small merchants who had always been the audience rather than the target of his operations, a narrative frame that said something important about how they understood their own world. The frame was Robin Hood. The frame was a man who took from those who had too much, and if he did not exactly give to those who had too little, at least demonstrated that the powerful were not untouchable. That the great mining companies, with their absentee owners and their company stores and their wage structures that kept men in permanent debt, that these institutions were vulnerable, that a smart enough, bold enough man could reach into their coffers and take what he wanted and disappear into the mountains. Whether this narrative was accurate is almost beside the point. What it reflected was real, the real resentment of ordinary working people toward the economic structures that govern their lives. The real desire for evidence that those structures were not as impervious as they appeared. Red Jack Lupo became, in the folk imagination of Colorado, the proof of that vulnerability. He became the embodiment of a fantasy that many harbored but few had the courage or the capability to act on. And that is how ordinary criminals become legends, not by being what the legend claims they were, but by being close enough to something people need to believe in, that the gap between the reality and the need gets quietly closed by the imagination of those who tell the story inside Cannon City. Lupo almost certainly received word of his growing legend through the channels available to him. What he made of it privately is unknowable. A man of his self-awareness and intelligence would have understood. Mechanism would have recognized the distance between the figure being celebrated in the saloon stories and the person sitting in a prison cell serving out a sentence. He had always understood the difference between the performance and the performer. The legend was the performance, continuing without him, taking on a life he could no longer direct or control. There were men inside the prison who knew who he was. Some of them had been on the periphery of Colorado's criminal world during his active years, Men who had heard his name spoken with reverence, who had perhaps seen him from a distance at some point, who now found themselves in the strange position of sharing an institution with the figure their world had treated as its most capable operator. How Lupo navigated this, how he managed the particular social dynamics that his reputation created inside a prison, is another of those interior chapters that the records do not fully illuminate. What can be said is that he did navigate. He was not a man who would have been careless about the social consequences of having a significant reputation in a confined space. Where reputation and its management were matters of daily practical importance, he served. The years accumulated. The sentence moved forward in the way that sentences do, not evenly, not with consistent speed, but in the particular rhythm of institutionalized time. Where weeks can pass in what feels like days and single afternoons can expand to fill a month. The world outside continued to change. The world inside the walls maintained its own grimly stable consistency. And then, at a point in the historical record that is genuinely difficult to pin down with precision, because the documentation around his later incarceration is fragmentary, in ways that suggest either poor record-keeping or deliberate obscurity, Joseph Lupo left the Colorado State Penitentiary. Whether through the completion of his sentence, through a parole process, through some legal proceeding that reduced the original term, or through some combination of these factors, he walked back out through the door that had closed behind him. Years before, he was older, significantly older. The red hair that had given him his name, and that had been in his active years, as much a part of his identity as his intelligence or his discipline, that hair had changed. Time had worked on it the way time works on everything, draining the vivid copper color, replacing it with something grayer, something that the years had touched with their particular kind of inevitability. He was lean still, the prison diet. And the labor had ensured that, but the leanness was different from the leanness of his operating years. This was the leanness of a man who had been used hard by time rather than the leanness of a man in his physical prime. The Colorado he stepped back into was a genuinely different state from the one he had known. The visual landscape was different. The towns had grown. The roads were different. The vehicles moving on them were different. The pace and sound and smell of daily life had shifted in the thousand small ways that accumulate into something categorical over a decade or more of radical change. The human landscape was equally different. Most of the people who had known him during his active years had moved on, moved away, aged into different lives, or died. The networks that had sustained him, the web of contacts and safe houses and sympathetic ears and strategic relationships that had made him capable of operating at the level he had operated, all of that was gone, dissolved by time and prosecution. And the simple entropy of human relationships deprived of the organizing force that had held them. Together, he had no organization. He had no plan, as far as anyone knows. He had whatever physical assets he had been able to preserve through the years, and here the record is entirely silent. Because a man of his intelligence would have made arrangements, would have hidden resources in ways that were not traceable, would not have walked out of prison with nothing but whatever those resources were. They were the resources of a man starting over in a world that had moved on without him. Asterisk, what did he do? Where did he go? These are the questions that the historical record answers with its most frustrating silence. The accounts that exist are contradictory and impossible to fully verify. Some suggest he remained in Colorado, settling under an assumed name, which would not have been difficult for a man who had maintained multiple false identities throughout his career in one of the smaller mountain towns where the pace of life was slow enough and the population transient, enough that a man could exist without attracting the kind of scrutiny that a larger city would have generated. Some accounts place him in New Mexico, some in Wyoming. One account, which is probably apocryphal but which has been repeated enough to earn a place in the tradition, suggests he made his way west to California, to one of the coastal cities where the 20th century was already arriving, with full force, and where a man with a complicated past could disappear into the anonymity of urban modernity